Good afternoon and good morning to US. Welcome to the last Next Pharma Summit webinar before summer break. Today we are discussing some very interesting topic, which is digital health for pharma, core challenges for successful program delivery. First of all, I would like to put also a disclaimer, which is that all panelists are representing their own views and opinions and not these of their employers, past, present, or future. And really glad to welcome Francesca Wuttke, the Chief Digital Officer from Almirall. Hi, Francesca, how are you?
Hi, hello, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Welcoming Jim O'Donnell, the President of H3 Connected Health. Hi, Jim, how are you?
Hi, everyone.
And Shwen, Gwee, the VP and Head of Global Digital Strategy from BMS. Hi, Shwen, how are you?
Hi, Dario, nice to be here.
Okay, thank you very much for the short introduction. So as said, we are having a lot of work to do to discuss this very interesting topic and very interesting theme. Just for information to all registrants and participants, this will be recorded and afterwards published on our official YouTube channel. First of all, I would like to pass the stage to Jim, who would definitely like to set the stage for today's webinar. So Jim, the stage is yours. Please let us know what do you understand under modern digital health solutions and their types. Jim?
Thanks, Dario, and hello, everyone. Yeah, so I volunteered to try and scope out a little bit the discussion for a few minutes before we get into panel discussion. So I guess one of the first topics when we were preparing for this was the usual one, which is what do we mean by digital health? And the term digital health has been around for a long time, as everyone knows, but the definition of it has always been a little bit vague, and I would say open to many different interpretations. And that's why it was a good initiative and a welcome initiative, I think, at the end of last year when the Digital Therapeutics Alliance tried to scope this out a little bit and be specific about terms like digital health and digital medicine and digital therapeutics. And I guess the things that these solutions that we're going to talk about today have in common is the first is that they're all focused on improving patient outcomes fundamentally. That's the core purpose behind them. The second is that they will, they're typically, because they're going to make clinical claims, they're going to have clinical evidence requirements, and they'll typically also have medical device regulatory requirements because, you know, obviously if you're going to introduce a solution into this area and you're going to make clinical claims about its efficacy, you have to have evidence to back it up, and the regulatory authorities demand that as well. And I guess the other aspect that sometimes is confusing, I think, for people is, you know, if it's a digital health solution, does it just have to be software? And again, the Digital Therapeutics Alliance was good on this, and they said, look, it can be standalone software, but it could also be used in combination with a pharmaceutical treatment or with a medical device. So it can be standalone or it can be combination. So really, digital health is inclusive of the spectrum of solutions that meet these set of criteria. And again, just to be specific in terms of examples, you know, you could think of something like medication adherence. I think a medication adherence app as being a general digital health solution, but probably not a digital therapeutic. Whereas a digital therapeutic would deliver evidence-based digital interventions, something like, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. And typically also a digital therapeutic will be classed as a medical device in the various jurisdictions. So if we just go on to the next slide, Dario. So that's just kind of scoping it out. I guess the next question, and this is a kind of a graphic that we created just to kind of give a sense of it. You know, digital health again is relevant for, you know, payers, providers, for patients, for clinicians, but specifically to try and locate it a little bit in terms of what it means for pharma and for biotech companies. And typically, pharma and biotech companies will be interested, their interest in digital health is going to be driven by a variety of different business objectives. That could be around improving pharmaceutical brand performance. So that could be through differentiating the brand. It could be through offering solutions around medication adherence and generally supporting patients and having better outcomes on the brand. It could also be driven by an objective which is around creating and developing better real-world evidence and generating insights from that could be used either on the R&D side of the business or on the commercial side of the business. Or it could be that the goal of the pharma company that's involved in this is to develop new modalities of care, maybe some of those combination therapies, and maybe to generate new independent revenue streams from things like digital therapeutics. So there's a variety of business reasons that where pharma could be interested in creating these solutions. And whatever the driver, it's important to understand that as you kind of go from the basic digital health solutions, which sometimes are quite tactical programs, up to digital therapeutic solutions and condition management solutions, that these programs become more strategic. They require a higher level of internal stakeholder sponsorship. They're typically going to be more expensive because of the evidence requirements and the regulatory requirements. And therefore, they become much more significant and strategic programs, I think, inside pharma companies as you go from left to right in that diagram. If we go on to the next slide, Dario. And I think when we look at the clinical and the regulatory requirements and the evidence requirements, many pharma companies also think about, are they going to do all of that in-house, which may be an option for some companies, or are they going to work with external partners? Because often around digital health solutions, a lot of the competences and capabilities, whether it be behavioral science, health economics, technology creation, support, all of these aspects, there's a broad set of capabilities required to build digital health solutions to market. And so that's why I think a lot of pharma companies will look to partner with external companies as well. And in that partnering, it's very important to think about and have a clear expectation, I think, on both sides about what each party is expected to bring to the table. And this is just a very, as basic common sense model that says, I think it's a reasonable expectation from a pharma company that if they're working with an external party, that party is going to bring a kind of a deep understanding of how digital health solutions can be used to address patient and clinician needs. They can also expect that the external partner is going to have knowledge and capabilities for creating and also supporting and delivering those digital health solutions. And they should also expect, I think, that those external partners know something about how to navigate the regulatory processes and the reimbursement process also for digital health solutions. So these are kind of the digital health solution domain expertise that you'd expect to be brought from external partners. And then the natural deep understanding of pharma around disease and clinical pathways, around carrying out clinical studies and evidence creation, and that generally that broad commercial presence and capability across global markets. They're the elements that you'd expect that pharma bring to the table. But in a sense, that's kind of the basic model. And if we go on to the next slide, I think in our experience on a number of programs, the content of the previous slide are kind of the basic requirements. But the question, the kind of more complex questions come in then around things like, who's going to be the legal manufacturer? If it is a regulated medical device, if it is software as a medical device, is the pharma company set up to be the legal manufacturer of that? Does it have the right quality management systems in place for software development, for example? And does it want to be the legal manufacturer of that? Because there are arrangements where a pharma company can be the distributor of the solution and the service, but maybe the external partner is the legal manufacturer. So that's an important decision, because with those legal manufacturer responsibilities, come a lot of responsibilities, but also potential liabilities as well. A second aspect is who's going to be responsible for the data management, the analytics, and the insight generation that is required to really make these services deliver value. Is there going to be a platform that's used to try and get efficiency across multiple solutions? And if so, is that platform going to be something that comes internally from the pharma company that their team has created, or is it going to be an external platform? And I'm going to talk about platforms a little bit on the next slide as well. And then when it comes to just when you've created the solutions, when it comes to the go-to-market part, who's going to be responsible for go-to-market execution? In a lot of cases, that might be the pharma company, but in some cases, perhaps it's better as a commercial solution that's provided by a third party. And it may be that the third party has some relationships that can be leveraged or some presence in the market that can be leveraged as well. Who's going to do the lifecycle support and the service evolution? Because one thing about digital health solutions, I guess, that's obviously quite different to traditional, let's say, to pharmaceuticals, is that these solutions, are always going to be evolving, and there's a regulatory process that covers that. But in general, no matter what someone might say to you, they rarely know whether something's really going to work in the market until it actually is being used by patients and by clinicians, and before you see that adoption. And typically, I think you need to be quite close to patients and clinicians.
Tim, we lost you. Can you maybe repeat the last sentence?
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry, I was just saying that in terms of the. Yeah, can you hear me?
Jim?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jim, I can hear you, so I'm not sure if it's just Dario who might not be able to hear you.
Just you, Dario. I think.
Yeah,
I think
I can hear you as well.
Jim, can you hear us?
Yes. So I'm going to continue on, Dario. I think you might have an issue on your side. So, okay. Okay. So look, just talking a little bit about platforms. So the last slide was about talking about partnerships and what those extended partnering models might be. One of the topics I mentioned was platforms, whether you go with an internal platform or an external platform. One of the things I think that is again, in the same way as digital health is a kind of an overloaded term, I think the term platform can be a bit of an overloaded term as well. People talk about a platform, and sometimes they're talking about quite different things. When you look at other industries and how they think about platforms, they divide them into three kind of categories. One is product platforms, one is innovation platforms, and one is transaction platforms. And product platforms really are around platforms that are designed to help you create multiple solutions on top of a common base. Often they're quite closed platforms. They're not intended for lots of third-party developers to develop solutions on top of them, and that's a product platform. And I would say the state of the art today, primarily within this digital health space and within pharma, is largely around these product platforms. But there are also concepts around innovation platforms, which are ideas around, can there be an open platform that lots of third parties can develop solutions around that create an ecosystem of solutions that are beneficial to each other? And those innovation platforms, they exist in other industries. Apple iOS is an innovation platform in a sense. Google Android is an innovation platform. Amazon Web Services is an innovation platform. But again, there's relatively few examples, I think, at the moment in digital health around what I would call innovation platforms. And then there's transaction platforms, and these are really more intended for how let's say users of solutions can connect with vendors of solutions in a sense, right? And again, there's lots of examples in other industries of this, but really what this is about is, for example, how can you provide a place where clinicians can go, they can access vetted applications, they can prescribe them, and in some way they can see the results and see how other people are getting on and how their peers are rating and seeing those platforms as well. And again, there's lots of examples outside of digital health, but there's only a few, I think, that are starting to evolve within the digital health space. For example, the Digital Pharmacy and Express Scripts, or the NHS Digital Apps Library, or companies like Celt who are trying to position themselves as again being able to facilitate the access to different digital therapeutics in different companies. And I think when pharma companies think about platforms, it's worth maybe thinking about these, the business reason for wanting to have a platform and which kind of category it might fall into. And then based on that, decide, is that something that should be done in-house, that the pharma maybe plays a role in creating or owning, or is it actually something that's better provided by a third party? So they're my initial warm-up thoughts, really just to get the conversation going. And with that, just hand back to you, Daria, and to the panel.
Thank you very much, Jim. We all agreed on 4 questions for today's webinar. And let's kick off with our first question, which is, which types of programs and digital health solutions are you currently seeing in your organization? So let's start with you, Francesca, first. Francesca, can you kindly reply on this answer, on this question?
So I would say there are several. So our mandate within Almirall is the end-to-end digital transformation of the entire company, including things like increasing the digital acumen across our associates. So some of the things we're working on are not digital and more technological innovation, things like robotic process automation. Some of that is being applied to use cases within digital health, but otherwise it's a bit broader. Within digital health specifically, we're working on a digital therapeutic. We're working on several patient adherence platforms, that one of which may evolve into a digital therapeutic as we generate more evidence over time. We're working on a number of commercial initiatives to reach out to our key stakeholders, patients and providers. Telemedicine is something that we've started to deploy in those countries that we're allowed to do so, and we can contact patients directly. So I think there are a number of things that that we're kicking off. The office is quite in its infancy, and that it started when I joined back in February of 2019, so just about a year and a half ago. But the idea was, first to kind of landscape the entire organization, figure out what use cases resonate most with our strategy and our business needs, and then see where and if digital solutions and services have a role. I think the most important piece in looking at a digital strategy across an organization, such as a pharma organization, is to first decide what's the job to be done, what problem are you solving for, rather than throwing cool tech at solutions, which has often been the case and has often led to some less than successful initiatives. So first figure out if a digital solution or service can solve for a problem in a way that that either brings efficiency, brings a different channel for the business, or brings additional revenue or access to patients.
Thank you, Francesca. Shwen, can we continue with your answer on this question?
Sure, Dario, thank you. And I will say that I won't answer specifically about my current organization, but just in terms of the trends I'm seeing across the pharmaceutical industry over the last few years. I think certainly we've dabbled in the digital health space, depending on how you define that. And I think we'll stick with the definition Jim had at the start of this conversation. More broadly, I think, pharma has been trying to get into the digital health space quite a lot for a long time. If you remember when apps were the big thing, there was a proliferation of apps and everybody had one for every purpose. I think now we're starting to be a bit more refined and a bit more focused on what we're actually developing digital health solutions for. And to Francesca's point, we're trying to understand where are the areas where we can actually solve those problems leveraging these digital health solutions. And so what I'm starting to see a rise of are, especially in the customer engagement standpoint, whether it's engaging with patients or providers, for example, conversational AI and bots are big, both in terms of chat bots and voice bots as well. I think that's a space where you're starting to see a lot of activity and a lot of platforms. Certainly telehealth in the times of COVID has started to really skyrocket in its usage, and I think that's a part which maybe not fully adopted, but certainly a lot of experimentation is going on. Also, just in general, digital medicines and digital therapeutics, where there may be a level of intervention or outcome-driven platform to help patients really manage their disease. Those are areas which I'm starting to see a lot of activity on as well. So I think there's a variety of things that are going on, everything from the start where we're starting to apply AI towards R&D and drug discovery, all the way through to once our drugs get prescribed, how we're actually supporting patients, managing their disease, and really trying to drive better outcomes for them.
Thank you, Shwen. Jim, same question to you.
Yeah, so I guess I'm talking from a perspective, I suppose, as a vendor who works with a number of different pharma companies across different disease areas, and we're working on about 20 programs at the moment across really a range of disease areas, from rare diseases through to kind of the autoimmune oncology areas, through to the kind of large chronic disease areas, and all the programs are a little bit different. I think on the rare disease side, there's a big emphasis on real world evidence gathering, and gathering and understanding disease progression, and understanding that over time, and so therefore that's often it's around providing clinical tools and tools to help patients generate real world data, essentially, and gather that and make that available to clinicians, and be able to look at and understand the trends around that. In the autoimmune areas and the oncology areas, because they're kind of super competitive, I guess, at the moment as well. There is a large tendency, I think, where one organization has a solution in one disease area, that because there's maybe 5-6 treatments in that area, that the other organizations feel like they want to create solutions similar as well. And those solutions, I'd say, are the most sophisticated solutions at the moment that we're seeing, at least. So they typically are trying to, because they're complex conditions, they're trying to, again, support patients, maybe by combining and making available a range of different types of interventions, digital therapeutics, medication adherence, condition management. So quite a kind of a mix of things together, rather than just one specific thing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, around kind of the large population conditions like diabetes and asthma, and those kind of large chronic conditions, increasingly, I guess, there's a use of wearable devices in those areas, right? And connected drug delivery devices, and because essentially most of the treatment there obviously is happening in the wild. People, it's a large population, so it needs to be largely a digital self-serve solution, essentially. And I think that's where a lot of, as I say, wearable, even implantable devices are kind of coming into the mix. So it's quite a spectrum of programs, but I think there's a definite kind of upsurge at the moment, and also I think an extra degree of realism. As Shwen said, I think a few years ago, people didn't necessarily distinguish too much between marketing apps and kind of digital health apps, and it was just kind of, let's do an app. Whereas I think now there's a much better understanding of what's involved and what the differences are, and so I think the first level of maturing is kind of happening in the industry, I think.
Yeah, and I fully agree with that. I think as the digital office, we've kind of put a moratorium on apps and websites, because that's not what we're trying to do here. But I think we've been able to somewhat change the narrative to things like digital therapeutics. No, it's not just an app; it's actually software. Software as a medical device. It's a therapeutic delivered potentially via an app or via another platform, but the app itself isn't the distinguishing factor. I think the bar is increasingly being set higher and higher by pharma, which is great to see. I think the need for clinical evidence is key, and I think the differentiation from a product perspective, to some extent, can be gleaned by the addition of a digital therapeutic for those complex diseases that are either multifactorial or that require multimodal care, diseases with high degrees of comorbidities. Something like a digital therapeutic can really help the physician treat the patient more holistically, rather than just treating a particular indication. And that's attractive, obviously, to patients, but also to physicians.
Thank you, Francesca and Jim. So we can conclude that the sphere is like Apple App Store 10 years ago. Everyone wants just to develop app. Okay, so let's move forward to the first question to our audience. I will launch the question now, which is, what solutions are you currently developing? We are having 5 possible answers, so I would kindly like to ask you to respond on the particular answer so that we can comment the answers on that question. Please move ahead with the answering. So we can give like 1 minute time to answer all questions? Okay, so we are at 15%, 20 seconds left. Of course, our panelists should answer as well. Don't be afraid. Okay, 40% of people answered on that, and I will close the pool and share the results. So the results are, the absolute winner is digital health, lifestyle, education, and support. Dear panelists, what's the comment on that?
Dario, I don't think that's very surprising. I think in general, most of the pharma companies in general probably would be experimenting in that space more than any others, mainly because it's probably the easiest to get into with the lowest sort of requirements and lowest barrier to entry. I think once you start getting into the other spaces, you're starting to really start to get into a space where you need the clinical evidence, where you need some kind of regulation, and you need to be aware of all the different rules and regulations around what you need to do in order to drive those forward. So it doesn't surprise me. I think pharma is also in a space now where they're starting to understand how to leverage some of these platforms and solutions for digital health in coordination with their business strategy, because they realize that a lot of patients, besides needing the prescription drug that they to manage their conditions, also require some kind of behavioral change or education support in order to change their lifestyle. And therefore, I think we're starting to see a proliferation of that kind of support services being driven by digital health.
Thank you, Shwen. Francesca, Jim, any comment on the results of the survey?
Yeah, no, I would certainly concur with Sven. I think this poll required us to choose one. I think increasingly many of us are looking across several of these different types of approaches. I think with regard to digital therapeutics in particular, the most recent metric that I heard recently was that $7 billion of investment in R&D from pharma was going into digital therapeutics. So I expect that number to increase, and I also expect that there'll be a transition to some of the digital health products as they gather more evidence to become digital therapeutics over time. I think the term digital therapeutics is quite in vogue, and just as AI also is, and blockchain was a few years ago. So I congratulate the Digital Therapeutics Alliance for creating a nomenclature that should be universally applied, so that we know the difference as an industry between things like digital therapeutics and digital health or digital medicine.
Thank you, Francesca. Jim?
Yeah, look, I agree. I agree with both Francesca and Shwen in terms of what they've said. I think the other thing that can happen, apart from the fact that it's probably a little bit easier sometimes to develop the initial lifestyle and education type applications, I think sometimes that's also a way of starting to engage and learn as well, in terms of and gathering data about how patients engage with the kinds of solutions that you're developing, figuring out a little bit what works, gathering some data that then can be used to either evolve the product towards a more regulated product, or can be just used to as insight into creating a new product. So it's an entry point. So it's probably not surprising that that's the highest one at the moment.
Yeah.
And if I could add to that, Jim, one quick thing to add is just, I think just in terms of the number of solution platforms that are out there as well, certainly you'll find a lot more in the digital health space than you will start to narrow down the numbers in digital medicines and then digital therapeutics, just because of those barriers to get through each stage. So that's also, I think, another reason is there are a lot more partners to work with out there.
Yep.
Thank you. So if no further comments we have here, let's move forward to our second question. which is why are the business drivers behind these programs in your organization? Let's start with you, Shwen, first. So can you give your answer on that question?
Sure, I think it comes back to what Francesca was saying at the start, which is really what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And a lot of times, in the past at least, I think Pharma was famous for trying solution first sort of approach, which was probably not as useful as, there were tons of solutions out there, but they weren't solving a lot of problems. They were just sort of trying to do, to an extent, the job of a marketing platform. Whereas now I think it's become a lot more top of mind to start looking at where the pain points are that in a patient journey, for example, where we can actually really create a lot more impact, where we can drive outcomes, where we can really change the progress or of the disease or manage the condition in a way that's going to drive better clinical outcomes. So I think that's really where the business drivers are, is to understand where you can create the most value to manage the patient's disease or change the behavior in a way that's going to drive those outcomes. Because I think as we get much more into a value-based world, certainly in the US at least, we're going to need those clinical outcomes to demonstrate the value of what we're developing. And so certainly that to me is probably the biggest driver, is to be able to get the type of data and insights you need to show the value of your products. And then beyond that, that data can go on to have a life cycle of its own as it starts to inform your research and development opportunities as a result of that.
Thank you, Shwen. Jim, can you please continue on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and again, I'm speaking a little bit from the outside in terms of what we're seeing across a range of the partners or companies we work with. But I suppose the first thing to say is that it's really important to have a business driver, to have a clear business need. And it sounds funny, but often there isn't, because sometimes people can get tasked with creating something. And one of the first questions we'd always ask is, so what's the business rationale for this? And sometimes the answer is, well, we want to be patient centric and we want to improve patient outcomes. You're kind of going, yeah, that's great, but if this is going to cost a lot of money, whose budget is it coming out of? Why are they prepared to spend that money? Because we all want to do the right things by patients, but in reality as well, there has to be a real clear business driver and business benefit from it. Whether that can be a long-term benefit or it can be a short-term benefit, but there has to be clarity. And I think the most successful programs we've seen and been involved in are the ones where there's senior stakeholder clarity around what those business drivers are. Yeah. So I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that. I think there's a collection of business drivers, and I think as Shwen alluded to, I think in reality, if you're doing it right, there's probably multiple business benefits. But at the end of the day, I think it's important that if somebody says, okay, your budget's just been cut by 20%, why are you going to continue to do this one? Someone has to answer that question, or else you're going to get in trouble. If these are multi-year programs, you're going to get in trouble 12 months down the road.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jim. And in fact, this morning I spent with my colleagues on the executive committee doing exactly that, trying to get business buy-in for, in this case, a digital therapeutic, and moving it forward based on the business case and the MPV. But I think the business drivers are, how is this going to drive the business? So it's very ROI driven, and should be, just as any other product, whether it's in R&D or commercial or an M&A or BD&L opportunity would be. I think all too often budgets are allocated to groups that are focused on digital without a clear mandate, and they're told, invent cool stuff, or here's a technology budget. And I think unless you link it directly to a business benefit, it will probably not get the right buy-in that it deserves, but it also won't be able to demonstrate even the value of that particular technology in a meaningful way to the organization.
I think just the other thing is that the kind of counterpoint to it is clarity around the business drivers is great, but sometimes that leads to an expectation around KPIs that are not deliverable as well. So in the short term, because these things are quite difficult to measure because of their nature, right? And sometimes I think the two can get over equated because if you want to show a revenue impact on a brand, maybe it's going to take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years before that really comes through, right? And if the business driver is around that, sometimes I think it's also important to figure out, well, what's the time frame around KPIs that are really measurable and deliverable, because that's the other aspect of, I think, maintaining and keeping support within organizations.
No, absolutely. And what we tried to do, at least this morning, was change the narrative a little bit and ask for the same degree of patience that some of our colleagues in R&D would be asking for a similar R&D project at the same stage, or even an opportunity that we bring in from a licensing perspective. So putting it in the context. Putting something new in the context of something that's known is often helpful to manage the expectations, but also to appropriately right size the KPIs in terms of reach, but also of timing.
Yeah, Jim, I think you bring up a great point about measurement versus sort of estimated value over time, right? Which is it's almost like in the .com boom and the evaluations that startups used to have in terms of like, oh, we'll get an ROI of $1 billion in 1 year, right? It's easy in a sense to put that value estimate up front, but in terms of how are you actually going to measure that impact and know whether you've actually got that return, that's much harder. I think the second part that sort of equates to almost like a startup world is a lot of times when you look at innovative startups and so on, you start to see that hockey stick where they actually went down before they started collecting, they started taking off in terms of the value and the KPIs that they're starting to return. And I think pharma, when it comes to digital, at least in the past, has had the tendency to cut things off the minute it starts going down rather than waiting for it to, over time, to really start to see the value as it starts to take off and adoption starts to happen. And that's a lesson we have to learn, is to start to treat it in a way that we understand the long-term value and how the progression as well, before we can actually start seeing some of these KPIs come true.
Exactly, and I think also appropriately probabilizing the success of opportunities. No one in R&D would expect that 100% of their phase 1 development programs would be a success. So I think putting those reasonable metrics, and then that also allows you to have conversations, which I'm sure many of us have had. Well, I tried something 5 years ago and it didn't work. That doesn't discount an entire genre of their therapies and applications and solutions. So.
Thank you. Let's move forward to the next pool. I will launch the pool now with an interesting question to our audience. What is the main driver for solutions development in your company? Once again, we will leave 1 minute to respond on that pool. So let's see the answers on that. Okay. 1% vote.
Maybe it's a hard question.
Yes, it's tricky.
Okay, we are growing in terms of the response. Okay, 15 seconds left. Okay, so 50% of the people responded. I will close the pool and share the results. So the obvious winner is with 47, with the first place, improving patient outcomes. Who would like to make any short comment on that?
Maybe I'll jump in. I think all of us are in this business to improve patient outcomes. So that is certainly the goal. I think digital solutions allow us to put the patient in the front row seat, if you will, more than a lot of other potential applications. But you know, not to be overly controversial, but I think with this question, if you improve patient outcomes, you will get differentiation from competitors. You will generate real-world data and evidence, and you can potentially establish new revenue and business models. So while the patient outcomes piece is at the core, it's in my view so intrinsically linked to all of these other these other drivers that it becomes. It should be the reason why we're doing it, but it also there's also a business benefit, you know, that goes beyond the patient outcomes as well, that I think should be taken into account.
Thank you, Francesca. Jim, Shwen?
I was just going to say maybe we should have had another answer there, which was all of the above.
Yeah.
I agree that you know, patient outcomes are certainly the primary reason we're all doing what we do. But to Francesca's point, I think you know, a digital solution or a digital platform is the one solution that we've had now in our arsenal that we've never had before, that allows us to truly understand what are the outcomes of the patient over time, right? In the past, you know, when it was more molecular based and just the pill or the type of treatment alone, once it was prescribed by the doctor, the only information you could really find out was whether they actually filled that prescription or not. There was no real way to understand over time whether they actually drove better outcomes for the patient or not, other than maybe you know, readmissions and so on. So I think with digital health solutions, what we have the potential to do is truly understand what type of outcomes we're driving and how we can potentially accelerate and improve those outcomes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the context of a poll question, I think, you know, by its nature, you have to ask pretty generic, you know, high level, or give pretty generic high level options. And you know, I suppose the first thing that any of us would probably ask if we were having a discussion with someone who said, right, I want to develop a digital health solution that's going to improve patient outcomes, you'd kind of go, okay, so what aspect of the patient outcome do you want to improve, right? Or you know, what part are you going to focus on, right? And again, it's the specificity that's really important, because we all know that in most of the disease areas in which we work in, they're really complex conditions. Even things on the outside that you think are not so complex, of course, it turns out that they're super complex, right? And when you talk about, you know, for example, supporting someone in self-management so that they become better self-managers of their condition, that's a little bit more specific. But even self-management of something like heart failure, for example, is super complex, because it's a multi-dimensional challenge, right? You know, if it was easy, everyone would do it. It's not, and so it really, when it comes down to it in these solutions, it is about focus, and it is about clarity again of kind of what you're trying to achieve. I think it's good that that, you know, so many people chose patient outcomes in a sense, because that does. It does ground where the solution needs to come from, because fundamentally, you know, if it's a solution that's kind of primarily driven by business interest and doesn't have the patient interest at the center, in any case, it's going to fail, because it's not going to get the adoption and the engagement from patients and from clinicians. So fundamentally, I think it's probably, even if it's a very high level generic answer, I think it's probably the right answer actually anyway. So yeah, so I agree with the outcome.
Thank you. Moving forward with the third question, which is, when developing these solutions, what are you looking to do with internal and external partners? Maybe we can start this time with Jim. Jim, can you give the reply and answer to this question?
Well, I can give the external partner perspective. So again, what we're seeing is a bit of a spectrum. So I think again, as I'm sure you know, and in general, what's popular in this sector is, the famous RFP is produced, which defines, what some pharma company may be looking for from a partner in terms of helping to provide a solution. And I think in the past, a lot of those requests and looking for partners were focused on the development part, right? They were focused on, have you got experience? Can you give me examples of other digital health solutions that you've created that are a bit like mine, and those kinds of questions. What we're seeing now is that because the truth is that there's a much broader set of criteria that go into making a solution successful than just whether you develop a good one. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. And the other things that are required, I think, from partners are more kind of, I suppose, through the life cycle, from that kind of early kind of landscaping and concept element to understanding the patient journey, as Shwen was talking about earlier. That's kind of a key aspect to it, to being able to understand where the interventions that really are amenable to digital health solutions, where they fit within a patient journey, and what types of things they can influence, how you apply behavioral science to it, all the way through to then developing the solution, which is kind of the table stakes piece, through to then how does that solution evolve, and who operates it over time, who's the legal manufacturer, all of these things. So what we're seeing generally at the moment is a broadening out of the set of requirements for partners, right? So that there's a realization, and it is part of that kind of maturity, I think, that we talked about earlier, that it isn't about finding a development partner just per se. It's actually about a broader set of capabilities that maybe a partner needs to bring. At least that's, from the outside looking in, that's what it feels like in terms of the requests that we see and we're getting.
Yeah, no, I echo that. I think what Pharma's looking for is a way to fill an expertise gap in some way, with an external partner, but to really be almost an extension of the existing team. Because I think what's really important is that these solutions are co-created in a way that makes sense for both parties, the pharma and the solutions provider. I think having a very clear view in terms of what the short, medium, and long-term goals of the project are. I think you bring up a lot of important points about, who's going to be the owner, who's going to do the regulatory submissions, who's going to, if any need to be done, who's going to, maintain the regulatory files or IP or whatever it is that needs to get done. So that needs to be very carefully drafted, in advance. I would say, in particular with digital therapeutics, I'm seeing across the industry more and more, heads of digital therapeutics as part of either R&D or as part of digital teams. So the expertise is starting to be brought in-house, which is, I think, a really important transition. In my view, I see digital therapeutics as really the fourth wave of medicine. You have the small molecules, then the biologics, then cell and gene therapy, and now digital therapeutics. So if we as an industry are going to take it seriously as another therapeutic modality, then some of that expertise needs to be cultivated, but also ultimately brought in-house. So I'm pleased to see some of that. What I'd also like to start seeing, although it's a little bit too soon yet, are digital therapeutics marketeers, because I think the chasm right now sits, in how and who is going to market a lot of these solutions, and there have been some hiccups in the past in that regard.
Yeah, I think, Francesca, I totally agree with you, and Jim too. I think maybe the best way to answer this question is also to sort of identify where are some of the barriers that we have internally when we're trying to adopt some of these digital health solutions, and especially in the digital medicines and digital therapeutic space. And I think it starts as simple as, the problem definition, which is what we've been talking about all day, is really, sometimes when we see how simple it is, in a sense, to develop these digital health solutions, we forget that it should be grounded in solving a business problem. And so how is it that you're getting to the root cause of what you're trying to solve with that particular digital solution, I think is one barrier to entry that immediately is not as obvious, but is certainly the starting point of what we need to be thinking about. I think the other one is with the number of potential partners out in the digital ecosystem, how are we engaging with them and how do we know what the right one is? And then what is the process for actually working with them, partnering with them for all the reasons that Jim and Francesca both just identified. And then the third one, I think, is also once you find the right partner and you want to bring them in, our process for contracting and onboarding can sometimes be also a part of the challenge for what we need to do internally for bringing on a digital health partner. Because for good reason, we've set it up in a way to really be rigorous and to work with big companies, multinational billion-dollar companies. But when it comes to these smaller startup-ish, digital health solution type partners, they don't have an in-house lawyer. They barely have any money in the bank. They have not that much proof of their platform. That's why you want to work with them, is so you can actually start to generate some of those things. But our processes internally aren't always set up for that. So I think there's multiple challenges along the way, and it goes on to even just how is it integrated into the business strategy and not so much a standalone. A lot of times in pharma, at least in the past, I often have people tell me, I understand everything, but I'm not a digital person, so don't ask me that question. In the same way that digital has always been separated from overall marketing strategy or corporate strategy, whatever it may be, is X strategy plus digital, right? How we actually bring the two together, because if the two don't work together, it's not going to be successful either. So there's a lot of internal, I think, change management that needs to happen, both in terms of processes as well as culture, mindset, and so on. So I think a lot of those things need to change internally before we can actually start to really partner well and develop that relationship. And then I'll end with one thing that I think I've heard some people say, which is, stick to what pharma does well, which is really around traditional drug manufacturing. We're not, digital product developers. That's not our core, thing that we're good at. And so as we think about a partnership, let's leverage what we're good at and partner with somebody with what they're good at, and think of them as our extended product team. And how are we actually going to work with them in a way to actually bring the two together so that we can bring the expertise in science, they can bring their expertise in digital and technology, and then combine that in a way that really drives the business strategy overall.
Yes, and I think the key to success is having these integrated product teams, as you mentioned. I think that's really, really important, and development teams. In terms of the procurement issue, one of the, it's always been a bugaboo of mine, and what we try to do here, which perhaps is more tenable in a smaller or mid-sized company rather than big pharma, but we've created a separate approval path for startups and for digital solutions, so they kind of, to some extent, bypass the typical route. And we have a sort of hotline with the head of procurement, and she's very, very flexible, and we can say, look, we have this. They're a small startup. They can't read a 400-page contract because they can't afford to hire lawyers to read it on their behalf. So let's streamline this. What do we absolutely need? And let's put that in and take out all the fluff, if you will. So, but that's really important. It also positions your company as more startup friendly, and that word gets out in the ecosystem, and it makes it easier for other startups to partner with you as well.
Thank you. Let's move forward with a third cool question, which is, what are the key things that you look for in a partner? Multiple answer possibility. Once again, 1 minute for answering. Okay, still no one. Okay, we are receiving the answers now. Okay, 20 seconds left. This will be interesting. Okay, we are closing in 5 seconds. So I will close the pool and share the results. And the winner is can act as channel, execute go-to-market strategy. Frankly, I thought that the absolute winner will be can provide a platform, which is on the second place. But quite interesting answers, right? Who would like to comment?
Yeah.
Give a quick comment on that.
I was expecting the personal data piece to come out the strongest because that's, I think, an area that pharma struggles with. So maybe it didn't come out that way because people expect that to be a kind of bare minimum, that at least they have to manage patient level data in a reasonable way before they can even be considered. But for me, I would have expected that to come out on top.
Yeah, I have to say I'm slightly surprised by the answers, which is always good because it means we're learning something. I'm slightly surprised by the answers. I'm surprised that the league manufacturer is 0 because I've seen that quite a bit actually. I'm a little bit surprised that the can act as channel, execute the go-to-market strategy is so high as well, because certainly I think a lot of digital health companies and a lot of digital therapeutics companies see that as the, you know, one of the big advantages working with pharma companies is that kind of global presence, the multinational presence that enables and can and the larger sales teams and marketing teams that can enable that kind of go-to-market strategy. So it's interesting. It's interesting that the people answering the poll here have put that as a high interest for a digital health partner to provide, because most digital health companies are relatively small, certainly compared to pharma companies. So you would think that that would more naturally sit in the pharma company. But as I say, it's always interesting when you see surprises.
Yeah, I think you know, in a sense, I'm not so surprised that, you know, can be a legal manufacturer is low, but you know, the surprising thing is that it's 0. But because I think that's really very specific to when you start talking about digital medicines or digital therapeutics, and when we're talking about digital health as a broader term, you know, you don't really need to think about some of those things. But I think when you look at the first one, the platform, I think that's obvious. If they're not bringing the platform, I'm not sure what they really bring. But the last one as well, I think underscores the point of how we really need to start learning how to work with digital health platforms and solutions. It's I think what it says to me is that we still think of it as slightly separate from everything else we do. And so it's interesting to see that I too expected the data piece to be the highest number. So to see that the go-to-market strategy was the highest one is slightly surprising. But at the same time, when you think about it, I think it's there's still questions around in terms of, okay, we've got this solution now. How do we get it out to the masses? How do we drive adoption? How do we, like, there are things that we don't think of inherently as a pharma organization that is ready for that world. I think this is also relevant to what I said earlier about how we do the things that we're good at, but then a lot of times we look to the external partner to bring in how to work with digital and in digital.
Yeah, and to that point, I guess we've seen as well that, you know, sometimes when solutions are kind of created by, let's say, the global or the regional organization, and then you go and engage with some of the affiliate organizations, that that question, that go-to-market question, becomes a real challenging one, because maybe the affiliate doesn't have, you know, it's maybe a relatively small team, depending on the country. Maybe it doesn't have that, you know, that digital health either marketing or engagement with, you know, with clinicians kind of capability, and sometimes they're left a little bit to figure that stuff out, I think, right? Whereas, you know, maybe the team that originally created it, you know, more centrally, you know, had a kind of a vision for how it was going to work. But I think, I do think it's a critical piece, because I think that's where a lot of things kind of tend to fall down or aren't executed as successfully as possible. But I'm still a little surprised that that was seen as a kind of a partner requirement rather than a pharma requirement. It's interesting.
Okay, thank you. And moving to the last question of today's webinar, which is, what do you think about platforms and how does your company go about creating them? Let's start with Francesca. if she agrees, of course. We are actually having 1 minute left. I mean, just technically, of course. So please, Francesca, can you give the answer on that question?
Sure, I'll speak quickly. I think it's less about platforms and more about solutions. So I'm less concerned if something's a platform approach. You know, having been an ecosystem investor in the past, I think you can take point solutions, cobble them together, and create something that serves your needs better than using a pre-existing platform per se. So I think again, it's simply about making sure that you're answering for the right questions within the business, and that I think very importantly that you're choosing the right solution. So my team is sick of hearing me say over and over again, we have to landscape everything before we choose a solution or a provider, rather than just, you know, something was lobbed onto their desk and seems cool and let's use it. You know, I think most of the things that we think of might solve for parts of our problem, but let's make sure that we're finding the exact solution or creating a solution bespoke to solve for the problem, and not just, you know, partially solving for that, but really solving for something else.
Okay.
You know, I think part of it is also just your definition of what you mean by platform here, because I think most pharma companies, when they think about digital health, are not going to be creating that platform. They're going to be looking for external solution partners to bring that platform with them. However, as we start working with these solution partners, I'll call them, I think one of the concerns that we need to have is how prolific are we in discrete solutions, and whether we're creating a single platform where you're starting to standardize the approach, standardize the data structure, standardize the way that we actually operate in the backend technology. Because I think one thing that the healthcare industry as a whole has been I think not so good at was standardization, right? Part of the challenges that we're in now is everybody built a proprietary platform that, you know, in the end, you have so many different ways to do one thing because everybody wanted their own. So I think from a platform standpoint, it's more about how are we starting to standardize, because that standardization can actually drive a better experience for our patients, for our providers, for our different customers that we engage with. And so from a platform standpoint, for me, it's about really standardizing the way and making sure we don't have too many different ways of doing things and different platforms that don't talk to each other.
Yeah, I think interoperability is key.
I should have just said that.
And my very short, I see we're over time, so my very short thing is, again, I think, as you said, I think the definition of like a platform, again, is just this word that's used, and again, people have lots of different definitions of it. So you know, I think there's no doubt in 5 years' time that, you know, large companies, large pharma companies will want to have a common approach and a common technology base and a common, you know, go-to-market kind of infrastructure and all of that kind of broad sense of what a platform might be around things like digital therapeutics. I don't think it's there yet. So it's you would like to think that's the end result, but I think probably right at the moment the bigger focus is on actually building successful solutions and proving that, you know, that the model can work essentially, and getting that engagement, proving the business value, and replicating almost is kind of the stage I think we're probably at the moment.
Thank you, Jim. And the last poll for today, which is your company looking at platforms to deliver digital health solutions? Once again, we are having 1 minute to reply on that. So let's see the answers, if there will be some further surprises today. Okay, answers are coming in. 25 seconds left. Okay. And I will close the pool now and share the results. So the winner is yes with external partners to customize a product platform. Any short comment on that?
I don't think there's any surprise there. Please, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Francesca.
No, that's all.
Yeah, I was going to say there's no surprise. I think also one of the things that I think we need to be careful about is just investing too much upfront for the customization before knowing whether that platform actually will work for you or not. And certainly, I think a lot of pharma companies now are starting to develop more of an experimentation model where you can start to learn as much upfront. Certainly, you've got Almirall's Digital Garden as a place where they can incubate startups and start to experiment with them, test platforms, validate it before you actually fully invest in it and customize it to your needs. So I think that's important as a point towards customizing platforms.
Thank you.
Thanks for the shout out.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, so then I would like to close the webinar. It was very interesting. Thank you once more to attend as panelists to this very interesting discussion. Before we finish this webinar, I would just like to mention that we are moving also virtual with our next Pharma Summit, but with a quite interesting format, which we call Next Innovation Week, where we will have 2 sessions per day, each day from Monday to Friday, from 28th of September to 2nd of October. So please feel free to join. The attendance will be free of charge, which is quite radical and different, and hope to see you latest at the next Innovation Week. So thanks you once more for attending this webinar, and Francesca, Shwen, and Jim, thank you of course a lot for having you on this very interesting webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Pleasure. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.